Queens of the World. Princess Charlotte of Wales, the Queen Who Never Was. If you Google Princess Charlotte of Wales, you will be greeted by pictures of William and Catherine's adorable daughter, born in 2015. But there was another Princess Charlotte of Wales, born 200 years earlier, who had a much different life. She endured the neglect of parents who hated each other and the abuse of a father who saw her as competition. Still, she grew up resilient and brash. After dragging several young men along, she escaped into a happy love match with a dashing German prince, Leopold. They were every bit as popular as the current Prince and Princess of Wales. As the inevitable heir to the throne, Charlotte embodied Britain's hope for the future, and the birth of her first child was feverishly anticipated. But after horribly managed medical care, she died in childbirth at the age of 21. Her tragic death was mourned just as deeply as Princess Diana's. The race to sire a new heir produced the future Queen Victoria. So every British royal since, including the young Princess Charlotte, would not have existed were it not for the sorry fate of the original Princess Charlotte of Wales. Let's meet her. King George III of Great Britain and Ireland and Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz had a loving relationship which resulted in 15 children. But rather than secure the succession with a brood of princely grandchildren, the royal dukes took up with mistresses. Their many illegitimate children were not eligible for the throne, and their sisters were kept sheltered from marriage by their increasingly mentally ill father. Check out my series about George III's scandalous offspring. When the Prince of Wales turned 18, his parents, perhaps unwisely, gave him his own palace, Carlton House. Away from their watchful eye, he threw himself into heavy drinking and cavorting with women. He had excellent but expensive tastes. His annual allowance, £50,000, about $6 million today, was not nearly enough to keep up with his extravagant lifestyle. George frequently had vicious arguments with his parents over money and his love life. He became infatuated with a Catholic commoner, Maria Fitzherbert. But the spouse of a Catholic could not succeed to the throne, and he could not legally wed without his father's permission. Nevertheless, George and Maria had a secret wedding. When the news got out, the Protestant people were outraged. George III was already unpopular for losing the American colonies and pushing the Enclosures Act, which granted common land to the rich. And now it seemed his heir would be even worse. In 1788, the 50-year-old king suffered a serious decline in his mental health. He was unable to deliver the speech to open Parliament, so his 26-year-old son was named regent. King George wavered in and out of lucidity for the next 30 years. When he was well, he was in charge, and when he relapsed, the Prince Regent returned to power. He had no interest in producing a legitimate heir, but his lavish spending meant he was constantly in debt. During a lucid period, the king refused to bail his son out unless he finally made a legitimate marriage. The prince reluctantly agreed and was presented with a list of potential royal brides. While looking over his shoulder, Maria Fitzherbert steered him towards the least attractive candidate, who would be less competition for her. Caroline of Brunswick was the daughter of George III's sister, Princess Augusta. Her strict parents kept her secluded. She was not allowed to dance at her brother's wedding and had to sit with the old ladies. Unsurprisingly, she began to rebel. Though she was kept sheltered from gentlemen of her own status, her parents thought nothing of allowing her to go out to ride. She frequently left the palace to visit common people, and it was rumored that she had a secret affair and gave birth to a child. Caroline's overprotective parents and the rumors prevented her from marrying, and at 27 she was staring down a life of spinsterhood. But her parents couldn't turn their noses up when the British ambassador offered the Prince of Wales. So off to London Caroline went. When her groom first saw her, he called for a brandy. She wasn't his type, and the fastidious prince had concerns about her hygiene. George didn't impress Caroline either. She told a companion that he was very fat and nothing like as handsome as his portrait. At dinner, George was appalled by Caroline's chattiness and jibes at Mrs. Fitzherbert, also seated at the table. Caroline was disappointed by her groom's obvious preference for his mistress. But the contract was already signed, so the pair walked down the aisle the next day. George was drunk at the ceremony and only slept with his wife 3 times, twice on their wedding night and once the next night. After that, the newlyweds kept separate bedrooms at Carlton House so they could avoid each other. 3 times had apparently been enough, as exactly 9 months after the wedding, Caroline gave birth to a baby girl. She was baptized Charlotte Augusta after her 2 grandmothers. Though the royal family's popularity was in the dumpster, the birth of the second in line to the throne was celebrated nationwide as a glimmer of hope. Prince George was disappointed to have a daughter, but the king preferred girls and cherished his first legitimate grandchild. He hoped the baby would help to reconcile her parents. She did not. 3 days after her birth, George drew up a will bequeathing all of his worldly goods to Maria and giving his wife 1 shilling. The will also dictated that Caroline would have no role in her daughter's upbringing. Charlotte was cared for by nurses and governesses. Her mother was allowed 1 brief daily visit. Sympathetic nannies sometimes allowed Caroline to be alone with her daughter and even take her out for carriage rides, during which crowds cheered for the little princess. George was unaware, as he himself cared very little for his daughter and rarely visited her. Caroline couldn't take the misery of Carlton House and moved out, leaving her 1-year-old daughter behind. They were still occasionally allowed to see each other, but Charlotte was mostly used as a pawn in her estranged parents' battles. Despite this unstable upbringing, she grew up healthy and cheerful. She had a warm heart, but was reckless. When she was 8, her father moved her out of Carlton House to make more room for his mistress. Charlotte was given her own rooms at nearby Warwick House. Her father dismissed the nannies who had raised her for being too friendly with Caroline. Now she was surrounded by strangers who were paid to be there. Her new governess was fond of Charlotte, but too good-natured to discipline her. She brought her own 5-year-old grandson, George, to be the princess's playmate. The children were bosom buddies, and Charlotte displayed various unladylike behaviors, like riding horses and getting into fights. George later recalled an incident where a crowd gathered outside hoping to catch a glimpse of the princess. The 2 children joined the crowd, and no one realized that Charlotte was right in their midst. Her grandfather sent the Bishop of Salisbury to tutor her. He hoped that a religious education would make her an honorable and obedient queen. Charlotte paid little attention to his dronings and learned only what she wanted. She made faces behind the bishop's back and caused her ladies to stifle giggles. Once, when a politician came to call just as the princess was headed to the stables, she spanked him on the bottom with her riding crop and admonished him for being in her way. The princess did enjoy music and became a skilled pianist. When she was 10, her father got it into his head that he might divorce her mother, remarry, and replace her with a son. Caroline had been fostering an orphan, and the prince suspected the boy might be her illegitimate son with another man. While adultery was expected of husbands, for wives it was absolutely abhorrent and grounds for divorce. The prince launched an investigation into his wife's conduct. While it was underway, he forbade Charlotte to see her mother. Once, when mother and daughter caught each other's eye in the park, Caroline, afraid of her husband's wrath, ignored her daughter, who was deeply hurt. The investigation brought up no proof of impropriety, to the prince's horrific disappointment. When Charlotte entered adolescence, the court was shocked by her undignified behavior. She lounged instead of perching, allowing her ankle-length bloomers to show. She greeted men with a handshake and direct eye contact rather than demur, and she loved swearing to get a rise out of stuffy courtiers. The one thing her father did admire was that she was a fearless horsewoman. She thought nothing of jumping fences, which terrified lesser men. In 1810, King George began his final descent into mental illness. He talked incessantly, foamed at the mouth, rampaged through the palace, and held imagined conversations with his 3 dead children. Historians continue to debate if he suffered from porphyria, bipolar disorder, or some other affliction. 13-year-old Charlotte was fond of her grandfather and saddened by his condition. She should have been present when her father was sworn in as Prince Regent before the Privy Council. Instead, she rode her horse back and forth in the gardens, trying to catch a glimpse of the ceremony through the windows. The Prince Regent saw his daughter not as an heir, but as a rival for the affection of the public, a contest she was easily winning. One of the few things father and daughter had in common were their liberal ideas. But when George was granted the power of the monarch, he became more conservative and did not call the Whigs to office. Charlotte was outraged, and at the opera, she made clear her rejection of her father's politics by blowing kisses to the Whig leader, Earl Grey. George had spent his youth rebelling against his strict parents, so he was even stricter with his own child. He gave her a pittance for clothing allowance and insisted that if she attend the opera, she sit in the back and leave before the end. She had to spend most of her time with her maiden aunts. Bored, Charlotte began a flirtation with her first cousin, George Fitzclarence, the illegitimate son of Prince William, Duke of Clarence. When he was called away to the army, she transferred her infatuation to Charles Hesse, illegitimate son of Prince Frederick, Duke of York. The pair managed many clandestine meetings. Her governess looked the other way, and her mother, possibly living vicariously through her daughter's passions, even allowed the young couple to be alone in her room for several hours. Charles's father, the Duke of York, was a second father to Charlotte. He sent her the novel Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. She loved it and wrote back that she identified with Marianne. By the time Charlotte was 17, her father should have formally introduced her to society. But as he wasn't bothered, the Duke of York took it upon himself to throw a ball in his niece's honor at his luxurious estate, Oatlands. She had a marvelous time dancing and talking to interesting young people. Her father attended but ignored her. He twisted his ankle and tried to steal the spotlight by complaining loudly. After he left in a huff, the party continued. Now that Charlotte was out in society, her personality really shone through. At a dinner party, the subject of the suppression of Irish Catholics was hotly debated. Charlotte boldly stood up for the Irish Catholics, then burst into tears and stormed out. Her empathy was in stark contrast to her grasping father. Lord Byron wrote a poem about Charlotte called To a Lady Weeping. Weep, daughter of a royal line, a sire's disgrace, a realm's decay. Ah, happy if each tear of thine could wash a father's fault away. Weep, for thy tears are virtue's tears, auspicious to these suffering isles, and be each drop in future years repaid thee by thy people's smiles. Public opinion was clearly in Charlotte's favor, so George had no choice but to invite her to the opening of Parliament. Crowds pelted his carriage with gravel and jeered down with the regent, while Charlotte was greeted with joy, which she repaid with smiles and enthusiastic waves. To punish her for her popularity, her father fired her household staff, removing everyone who had raised her. He installed a new, much stricter governess, who was not appropriate for a 17-year-old woman. When Charlotte protested that she was old enough to have her own household, he roared back that he would never grant her that freedom until she was married. On this count, the regent did see a use for his daughter. Now that the Napoleonic Wars were going in Britain's favor, he wanted an alliance with the Netherlands. He decided Charlotte must marry William, hereditary Prince of Orange. He invited the prince to London, but William made a poor impression on Charlotte at the king's birthday, when he and all the other men present got drunk and slid under the table. Charlotte, who was eager for freedom, gave him another shot, but the more she got to know William, the less she liked him. He was not particularly engaging or good-looking. She went for dashing bad boys, and William was a milquetoast. Years later, he was known for having several homosexual affairs, so perhaps Charlotte picked up on his interests being more political than passionate. Public opinion was also against Charlotte marrying an heir to a different throne. The couple would have to divide their time between their realms. And Charlotte's Whig friends warned her that if she moved away to Holland, her father would very likely try to turn public opinion against her, retake his suit to divorce her mother, remarry, and replace her with a son. But the Prince Regent pushed hard for the match. He arranged another meeting, then demanded to know what his daughter thought of William. Charlotte answered gracefully that she liked him well enough. George took this as an acceptance and started drawing up a marriage contract. Charlotte reluctantly went along with her engagement, so long as the contract stipulated that she would not have to leave Britain against her will. But the more she saw other, more attractive bachelors, like Prince Augustus of Prussia, the more she grew discontent with her fiancé. So she pulled out a clever bit of game theory. During a ball, Charlotte informed William that when they were married, her mother would come to live with them. This was unacceptable to him, so he broke off the engagement. Later that evening, while trying to avoid her freshly ex-fiancé, she ran into Tsar Alexander of Russia. He advised her that if she wanted to make up with William, she could find him in the room just down the hall. As he had hoped, Charlotte went down the opposite hall and ran right into the Tsar's candidate for her hand, Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. The dashing German lieutenant general had spent much of his youth at the imperial court and fighting Napoleon in the Russian army. When Charlotte laid eyes on him, she inquired why he hadn't yet called on her, to which he replied, "Allow me to correct my omission." When the Prince Regent learned that his daughter had scuttled his intended son-in-law, he was furious. He dismissed her household again and informed her that she would be moved to Cranbourne Lodge at Windsor to live in isolation. Incensed, Charlotte raced into the street, but she had no money or experience of how to navigate the world. A man, seeing her distress, helped her into a hackney cab, which conveyed her to her mother's house. Her father issued a warrant for her arrest and sent the Duke of York to drag her home. He gently persuaded Charlotte to return to her father. The press made a great deal of the runaway princess, and public opinion against the Prince Regent grew darker. During her isolation, Charlotte was not given any ink, so she used milk to smuggle a letter to her uncle, Prince Augustus, Duke of Sussex. He demanded of the Tory Prime Minister when he would grant the princess her own establishment, so she could live free from her father. The PM went straight to the Prince Regent, who berated his brother for interfering. The brothers never spoke again. While she was locked up, Charlotte imagined Prince Augustus of Prussia as the White Knight who would rescue her. She was heartbroken when she received a letter from him, returning her locket and mildly informing her that he was engaged to someone else. Next, George received word that the Prince of Orange was set to marry a Russian Grand Duchess. With both of their hopes dashed, and during a long chat after Christmas dinner, father and daughter agreed to an alternative candidate, Prince Leopold. He became the princess's new imagined knight in shining armor, but he was tied up in the Napoleonic Wars and it took him 18 months to get back to London. When he finally arrived, the pair were reunited, and Charlotte was not disappointed. She wrote, "I find him charming and go to bed happier than I have ever done yet in my life. A princess never, I believe, set out in life with such prospects of happiness, real domestic ones like other people." The Prince Regent was also impressed with Leopold, and his advisors convinced him that the marriage had been his idea from the start. Parliament quickly passed a bill naturalizing Leopold as a British citizen and granted the couple a generous allowance to set up their own household. On May 2, 1816, crowds filled the streets to catch a glimpse of the golden couple. Charlotte's wedding dress cost over £10,000, about $550,000 today. I was lucky enough to see it at Buckingham Palace, and it is truly stunning, embroidered with silver flowers and shells and edged in Brussels lace. The only misstep in the beautiful ceremony was when Charlotte giggled when her impoverished groom promised to endow her with his worldly goods. The happy couple spent their honeymoon at Oatlands. Charlotte wrote in her diary that Leopold was the perfection of a lover. On the second day, the Prince Regent visited and spent 2 hours boring Leopold with descriptions of military uniforms. Charlotte took it in stride and was pleased that her father was in good humor. Their relationship was happier than Charlotte could ever have imagined. Leopold's steady nature calmed her anxiety, and he wrote that they never tired of each other's company, but were content to be together every hour of the day. They returned to London for the social season and took up residence in the newly purchased Claremont House. They attended the opera, where their public displays of affection thrilled the crowd, which cheered them on and burst into the national anthem. As the couple watched the opera, Charlotte fell suddenly ill and had to be rushed home. It became evident that she was suffering a miscarriage. A few months later, another loss followed. But by April 1817, she was 4 months along, and the couple felt comfortable informing the Prince Regent. Public interest in the royal baby was massive, and bets were placed on whether it would be a prince or a princess. After 2 miscarriages, Charlotte was understandably nervous and followed her doctor, Richard Croft's advice. By August, she had put on a great deal of weight and swelling. Croft feared that the baby would be abnormally large, and he put her on a limited diet, bed rest, and bled her regularly. Leopold's good friend and physician, Christian Stockmar, considered this prenatal care barbaric, but he declined to join the team, as he believed that, as a foreigner, if anything went wrong, he would be blamed. Charlotte became weak and depressed. When a trunk of baby clothes arrived, she ordered her cooing ladies to put them away, as she was sure she was going to die. She was due on October 19th, but contractions didn't begin until November 3rd. By this time, she was too weak to push the baby out. She labored for 50 hours, during which Croft denied her food. An obstetrician was called for, but Croft refused to allow him to use forceps to deliver the baby. Forceps were relatively new, and in a time before antiseptic, they carried a high risk of introducing infection. On the evening of November 5th, Charlotte finally gave birth to a 9-pound stillborn son. Efforts to resuscitate him, including rubbing mustard on his back, failed. There were signs that he had been alive only a few hours earlier, so forceps might have saved his life. Charlotte and Leopold were heartbroken, but she seemed well, and they were consoled that they had plenty of time for more children. Leopold, who had remained by his wife throughout the ordeal, was given a sedative and collapsed into bed. Charlotte was cleaned up, placed in bed, and given camphor julep to stimulate her heart. After midnight, she began vomiting and complaining of abdominal pain. Croft discovered that she was hemorrhaging. He sent Stockmar to wake the prince, who was out cold. Stockmar returned to Charlotte, who grabbed his hand and told him, "They have made me tipsy." Stockmar again left to try and rouse the prince, but he returned when he heard Charlotte cry out, "Stocky, Stocky." He ran back in the room to find her dead. The public outpouring of grief was enormous. Drapers ran out of black cloth, and shops, courts, and docks closed for 2 weeks. It was as though every household in Britain had lost a favorite child. The Prince Regent was prostrate with grief, and, drama not quite king that he was, he couldn't bring himself to attend the funeral. Charlotte was laid to rest, with her son at her feet, in the royal vault in St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The public collected money to erect a poignant monument to the princess and her son. Public blame for the loss of 2 generations of monarchs in one evening fell on the Prince Regent for not attending his daughter's delivery, and on Dr. Richard Croft. Modern medical historians suspect that Charlotte suffered from gestational diabetes and preeclampsia. Her placenta also broke apart, and Croft expertly removed it manually, saving her life at least once. But Charlotte's perilous combination of conditions would be high risk even today, and with the limited medical knowledge of the 19th century, Croft had little chance of saving her, no matter what decisions he made. Nevertheless, he was wrecked with guilt. 3 months later, while attending another laboring woman, he left the room, found a gun, and shot himself. As a result of the triple obstetric tragedy, death of mother, child, and doctor, early intervention, including forceps during prolonged labor, became much more popular. Charlotte's mother, Caroline, who had run away to the continent, fainted when she was told of her child's death. When Lord Byron was informed, he opened his window and screamed into the street, then began working on a somber poem. Even William, Prince of Orange, burst into tears. But the saddest person of all was Prince Leopold. He spent days refusing to leave her body. For years, he could not bear to be around carefree people. He left England and only returned in 1819 for the baptism of his niece. Without Charlotte, the monarchy desperately needed an heir, so the Prince Regent's younger brothers were offered handsome allowances if they left their mistresses, married foreign princesses, and sired legitimate heirs. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, wed Leopold's younger sister Victoria. They won the reproductive game with a daughter, Princess Victoria, who would go on to reign for 63 years. But one has to wonder what history would have been if instead of the Victorian era, we had the Charlottean era. 13 years after Charlotte's death, in 1830, Belgium gained independence from the Netherlands. They offered the new throne to Leopold, who became King Leopold I. After his heartbreaking first marriage, he had planned never to wed again. But in order to found a new dynasty, he needed an heir. He married Louise of Orleans, and they had 4 children. Leopold named his only daughter Charlotte, after the long-lost love of his life. She would go on to change her name to Carlotta and become the Habsburg Empress of Mexico. She had a fascinating and ultimately tragic life of her own. And in next week's episode, we'll meet her. Don't want to wait to see the next episode? Patrons get exclusive early access to all of my multi-part series. If you would like to join my Patreon and help me make more fascinating videos, click on the link in the description. Thank you for watching.